First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me a chance to speak about such important topic, that is opportunistic infections in hematological patients. So to define opportunistic infections, these are the infections which occur more frequently or with increased severity in individuals with compromised immune system when compared to a healthy, normal functioning immune system. So when we are talking about compromised immune system or immunodeficiency state, we should know that it can be either due to any congenital immunodeficiency or due to the acquired immunodeficiency. So here, this is a list of diseases which are associated with secondary immunodeficiency. And when we will take the hematological patients, so there are three conditions where the immunodeficiency can arise. So first one is the pathology itself, that is the malignancy, either leukemia, lymphoma, or the myelodysplastic syndrome. Second one is use of the medication, that is the chemotherapeutic agents and the immunosuppressive agents. And the third one in a post-stem cell transplant patient. So before going to the topic proper, we should have some knowledge about the normal immune function. So there are three layers of immune function, that immune response. That is, the first layer is the physical barrier, which provides 99% of the defense. Its components are skin, cilia, gastric acidity, and the normal bacterial flora. So in conditions like the burn, trauma, Steven-Johnson syndrome, any dermatological conditions, then cartagenous syndrome, where there is ciliary dyskinesia, prolonged use of antibiotics, which cause alteration in the bacterial flora, and chemotherapeutic agent, which can cause the mucosal barrier injury in terms of development of the mucositis. So all these conditions can impair the physical barrier. Then second one is the innate immune response. So this is the first response to any invading pathogen. So its components like mast cell and the macrophages, they activate the other components like neutrophils and the natural killer cells. And then the inflammatory cascade is activated. So here, the use of chemotherapeutic agent, use of steroid and biologic agents, so this can impair the innate immune response. Then the adaptive immune response, this is highly specific to any particular pathogen, and they provide a long lasting protection. They have an element of memory, and they can also distinguish between the self and the foreign element. So adaptive immune response has two components: humoral response provided by the B lymphocytes and the cell mediated response, which is provided by the T lymphocytes. So the common variable immunodeficiency, hypogammaglobulinemia, hematological malignancy, that is the B cell and T cell lymphoma, and use of chemotherapeutic agents. All this can again compromise the adaptive immune response. So as we can see here, hematological condition or in hematological patients, all the three layers can be affected. So now we'll discuss the what are the risk factors which are associated for increased risk of infection in a hematological patient. So first one is the neutropenia, which is most important and most common because of two things. One is the bone marrow is infiltrated with leukemic cell, so which is seen in AML and ALL patients. And the second is the aplasia caused by the use of chemotherapeutic agent. And second is among the chemotherapeutic agent, the maximum risk is due to anthracycline, cytarabine, and the fludarabine. Third risk factor is the functional neutrophil impairment, so which is seen in the myelodysplastic syndrome. So here the neutrophil count is normal, but there is functional impairment because of the differentiation defect in the multipotent stem cell compartment, either due to decreased cell membrane expression of the CD protein or reduced activity of the granule enzyme and the granule membrane. And third one is the defect in the neutrophil chemotaxis, reactive oxygen species production, and the phagocytosis. Other risk factors are like the host-related risk factors, that is the advanced age, the presence of comorbidities, genetic factors, environmental factors, so presence of central venous catheter and the invalidings. So this is common for all the types of malignancy, hematological malignancy patient. Now we'll discuss the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation and the risk factors associated with it. So hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, it has a 3 timeline which differentiate the risk factor associated with it and the type of organisms for the infection. So this timeline is again divided into 3 phases. The phase 1 is the pre-engraftment period, phase 2 is the post-engraftment period, and phase 3 is the late phase. So in the pre-engraftment period, which is the initial seen in the initial 30 days, so what happened here, the conditioning regimens are used and the stem cells are infused before the stem cell transplantation. So the conditioning regimen which are used, they are used to destroy the neoplastic cells, but along with that, they can also destroy the normal hematopoietic cells, that is the neutrophil, monocytes, and the macrophages. So in this phase, the chances of development of neutropenia is high, and hence the hosts are more prone for infection due to bacteria. That is mostly the gram-negative bacilli, gram-positive organism, and also gastrointestinal streptococcal species. And in a minority of case, viral infection, that is the HSV virus and the Candida infection, can also be seen. Then next is the phase 2 or the post-engraftment. So this is from day 30 to day 100. Here the host recover from the neutropenia, but the cellular and humoral immunity is impaired in this phase. And also there is impairment in the phagocytosis, development in the graft versus host disease. So this is the period of maximum immunosuppressants, and hence here the risk of development of opportunistic infection for the host is high. So these are like the cytomegalovirus infection, Epstein-Barr virus infection, infection due to Pneumocystis cerevisiae, Aspergillus infection, etc. The phase 3 is the late phase. Here, the impaired cellular immunity and humoral immunity is slowly recovers. And if there is no chronic graft versus host disease, then the infection risk in this phase is similar to a community-acquired infection. So here, as we can see in a stem cell transplant patient, either due to allogenic or the autologous, first is conditioning regimen, then the stem cell are infused. And after that, the engraftment started. So prior to that, this pre-engraftment period is associated with aplasia and the neutropenia. Now we'll see what are the factors which are associated with outcome in ICU patients of the post-stem cell transplant. So these are like the pre-transplant comorbidities of the patient, the transplant related factors, that is what type of transplant, whether this is allogenic or the autologous, then the conditioning regimen intensity, development of the graft versus host disease, and the functional status at the time of ICU admission, the severity illness score, that is the Apache and the SOFA score, involvement of the organ system like serum bilirubin level, serum lactate level, etc. Then there are some factors which are associated with the good outcome or the improved outcome in these patients. So these are the reduced intensity conditioning, use of better antimicrobial prophylaxis and improved antifungal therapy, then prophylaxis for pneumocystis infection and the cytomegalovirus infections. So these are the types of the hematological conditions and how these host defense are impaired, and they are prone for the infections, so which we have already discussed. Now we'll see some specific pathogens, the opportunistic pathogens. So first of all is the cytomegalovirus. Cytomegalovirus infection is a major cause of morbidity and mortality in the hematological patient, and more specifically in a post-stem cell transplant patient. So this is a ubiquitous beta herpes virus, which shows a period of latency after an initial infection. And that initial infection or the primary infection, most of the time this is asymptomatic, and some case it can be associated with the flu-like symptoms and fever. This CMV virus, they shows latency in the myeloid lineage. So after the reactivation, CMV can present either as a CMV infection or the CMV disease. So CMV infection means viral replication is there without the symptoms of the organ involvement. But in CMV disease, along with the viral replication, the organ damage are also present. So CMV disease can be presented as CMV syndrome, which is most commonly seen, or as a tissue invasive disease. So what is CMV syndrome? CMV syndrome, when the presence of one or more of the following symptoms are there, that is fever for more than 2 days, malaise, presence of leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, atypical lymphocytes, and increased aminotransferase level. So along with that, when there is evidence of the active CMV infection, this is known as the CMV syndrome. CMV infection is common in the post-engraftment period and at the time of the graft versus host disease. And when we consider the risk factors, the highest risk is seen in a post-transplant patient when the donor is seropositive and the recipient is seronegative. So it is higher than when both are positive and when both are negative. Then when the recipient is using the lymphocyte depleting drug, there is also high risk for CMV infection. Other risk factors are the acute rejection, the cord blood transplant receiver, and HLA mismatch. Apart from the direct effect shown by the cytomegalovirus, it can also cause some indirect effects, like it can cause graft dysfunction, it can cause immunosuppression, and hence predispose the host for increased risk of other opportunistic infections. The mortality of CMV infection is around 15 to 20%, and CMV pneumonia is associated with a higher mortality up to 80%. So they can show a variety of tissue invasive diseases. It can be pneumonia, it can be any GI disease, hepatitis, CNS disease, or like nephritis and pancreatitis. Then how to diagnose the CMV infection? The first one is the serology. Serology generally done prior to the transplantation for the serological status of a donor or the recipient for the risk stratification. Second one is the antigenomic assay. So here the PP65 is used. This is a rapid method to detect the CMV which are phagocytosed by the neutrophils in the peripheral blood. So the assay, they used a ratio of infected polymorphonuclear cell to the total PMN. This is highly specific, and the monoclonal antibody to the CMV PP65 protein is this is a specific and the early marker of the active infection. Then is the quantitative PCR for diagnosis of the viral replication. It can be done in plasma, whole blood, or the CSF. Then viral culture, it generally takes a long time and it has very low sensitivity. It can be used when the viral resistance is tested by the genotyping. Then the confirmatory is the histopathology. The typical intracellular inclusion body seen for CMV infection is the Olsai inclusion. The preventive therapy for CMV infection, it can be given either as a prophylactic therapy or as the preemptive therapy. So what is prophylactic therapy? Prophylactic means it is given to the patients who are considered as the high risk. So this is along with prophylactic to the for the CMV infection. It can also provide prophylaxis to HSV and the varicella zoster virus infection. And the other advantage for the prophylactic therapy is that it is associated with decreased graft rejection, and less early CMV infection is also less. But it is associated with higher cost, more drug toxicity, and higher risk of the late onset CMV infection when we are using the prophylactic therapy. Then the other one is the preemptive therapy. So this is for the viral replication above a threshold value. So what happened here? The weekly the viral load is tested either by a PCR or by using the PP65 method. So for the initial 12 weeks and when the this reached a positive threshold value, then the treatment is given. And this positive threshold value, this is something the site specific and assay specific, and it should be validated by the every individual transplant center. So this is a complex process because very difficult to keep compliance with the testing, and also associated with higher rejection and the graft loss. The drugs which are used for preventive therapy are ganciclovir, which is given intravenously at a dose of 5 mg per kg per day. And orally also the drug used is the valganciclovir at a dose of 900 mg per day. The treatment for CMV infection is only given for viral syndrome and invasive tissue disease. So for mild to moderate case, the valganciclovir is used orally, and for severe case, the IV ganciclovir can be used. So when there is a resistance to ganciclovir or toxicity, then the alternative drug is the foscarnet. And the length of the treatment is generally determined by the weekly monitoring of the CMV viral load, either by the PCR or by the antigenomic assay. Next, we'll discuss about progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. So this is a demyelinating disease of the brain, which is caused due to the JC virus, which is a double-stranded DNA polyoma virus. So what happened here? The initial infection is seen in the tonsillar region after inhalation of the virus. After that, they remain latent in the kidney and the bone marrow. And when there is a period of immunosuppression, they reactivated, and they appear in the blood predominantly in the cell-associated form. After that, they gain access into the brain, and they infect both the astrocytes and the oligodendrocytes. These infected cells, when they there is a lysis of this cell infected cell occur, the virions are released, and they can again infect the nearby or adjacent cells. PML is characterized by a subacute onset of the neurological deficit. There is no fever, optic nerve involvement is also absent, and no spinal cord disease is present. Radiologically, the MRI feature is characterized by unifocal or multifocal lesion in the white matter, which are typically non-enhancing and not associated with mass effect. PCR analysis done in the CSF shows the JC virus DNA. It can also be associated with some novel syndrome. So JC virus not only affect the white matter of the brain, it can also affect the cerebellum, causing the cerebellar atrophy. And other syndromes are like JC virus meningitis and encephalopathy. PML is associated with a very high mortality, that is within 3 months of the disease, it can cause 30 to 50% of the mortality. So whenever possible, the immunosuppressant drug should be discontinued, and various of the drugs have been studied. So these are like the cytarabine, cidofovir, interferon alpha, and interferon beta. Next is the human herpes virus 6. So this is also a latent infection. The primary infection seen in infancy, which is known as roseola or the 6th disease. So it remains latent in the CD4 positive T lymphocytes, monocytes, and epithelial cell, and reactivated during the period of immunosuppression. HSV-6B end organ disease can be encephalitis, which is known as the post-transplantation acute limbic encephalitis, the non-encephalitis CNS dysfunction like delirium and myelitis. Then it can cause hepatitis, pneumonitis, and myelosuppression and the allograft failure. HSV-6B encephalitis is characterized by encephalopathy, confusion, short-term memory loss, seizure, insomnia, etc. The brain MRI is often normal, but can present as circumscribed non-enhancing hyperintense lesion in the medial temporal lobe, most commonly in the hippocampus and the amygdala. And the CSF fluid analysis shows the HSV6B DNA. Along with that, there is mild protein elevation and mild lymphocytic pleocytosis is seen. It is associated with long-term memory defects and neuropsychological sequelae in the up to 60% of the case. And the mortality due to progressive encephalitis is up to 25% of the all hematopoietic stem cell transplant patient. And it is again higher for the patients, cord blood recipient patients. Diagnostic test for HSV6, the virus culture, which is considered as the gold standard, but this is very labor intensive. Others are like the viral antigen test by immunohistochemical staining. It has a slow turnaround time. Then detection of the viral mRNA by RT-PCR, quantitative viral DNA PCR, which can distinguish between the HSV6A and 6B. Treatment strategies for HSV6B, IV foscarnet at a dose of 90 mg per kg twice a day, or ganciclovir 5 mg per kg twice a day, recommended for the treatment of HSV6B encephalitis. And the therapy should be given for at least 3 weeks and until the testing demonstrates clearance of HSV6 DNA from blood and if possible from the CSF. Combination of the ganciclovir with foscarnet therapy can be considered if the either agent is failed. Then immunosuppressive medication should be reduced if possible. Next, we'll be talking about pneumocystis pneumonia, which is seen, which is caused by a fungus, that is the Pneumocystis cerevisiae. The incidence is up to 40%. They can present as subacute over a period of 2 to 3 weeks as fever, dyspnea, non-productive cough, and severe hypoxemia. The hallmark to suspect the pneumocystis infection is when there is hypoxemia out of proportion to the physical findings. Pneumocystis infection can also associate with other co-infection up to 70% of the case. This co-infection can be due to Staph aureus, gram-negative bacilli, CMV, and the Aspergillus. The severity of the pneumocystis pneumonia can be classified either as the mild, moderate, or the severe. In the mild case, there is increasing exertional dyspnea with or without cough and the sweats. But in case of moderate pneumocystis pneumonia, so there is dyspnea on the minimal exertion. And for severe disease, there is dyspnea at rest. Along with that, tachypnea, persistent fever, and cough is there. According to the arterial oxygen tension, for the mild disease, it is more than the PaO2 is more than 82. For moderate disease, it is between 60 to 82, and for severe disease, it is less than 60. The chest X-ray for the mild disease is generally normal or minor perihilar shadowing is seen. In the moderate case, there is diffuse interstitial shadowing, and in the severe case, extensive interstitial shadowing is seen with or without alveolar shadowing. So some poor prognostic factors for outcome in a PCP pneumonia, we should know that. So these are the factors at the onset of the disease and factors during the time of the treatment. So the poor control of the underlying disease, long-term use of the glucocorticoids, delayed onset of the PCP treatment, then co-infection with other virus like HSV or the CMV virus, and higher illness score, that is the high Apache 2 and the SAP score. These are associated with the bad outcome. And the factors during the PCP treatment, like use of vasopressor, and then respiratory failure and need of mechanical ventilation, ARDS, then when there is clinical worsening at day 8 and need for high dose of the glucocorticoid treatment. So how to diagnose? Sputum smear, which is least invasive, but it has a very low yield up to 50%. Then bronchoalveolar lavage can be done, which has a better yield up to 70% when used along with the antibody staining. Then transbronchial biopsy and the tissue biopsy can also be used to diagnose the Pneumocystis cerevisiae infection. So criteria for initiation of PCP treatment. So when the patient is at risk, along with that, the clinical signs symptoms are present, and with suggestive radiological findings, which is compatible with the PCP pneumonia, and with or without unexplained serum LDH level. So this is elevation of the serum LDH is more specific for HIV patients, but not for the non-HIV or the like hematological patients. So what are the treatment options for PCP pneumonia? So first line treatment is the cotrimoxazole. Dose of the trimethoprim is 15 to 20 milligram per kg per day in a divided dose of 3 to 4 times. This is given for at least for 2 weeks and 2 to 3 weeks. Others are like the pentamidine, 4 milligram per kg IV per day, and primaquine along with the clindamycin. The role of adjunctive corticosteroids. So this is used when the oxygenation, that is the PaO2 is less than 70 at room air, or the alveolar arteriolar oxygen gradient is more than 35 millimeter of mercury. So, but this steroid, this has a survival benefit for the HIV patients, but not in the non-HIV patient. So routine use of the steroid for the non-HIV patients is not recommended, and it should be made on individual basis. Second line treatment is given for intolerance or the treatment failure with the high dose of the cotrimoxazole treatment. So what is clinical failure? So clinical failure, when there is lack of improvement or worsening of the respiratory function documented by ABG after 4 days to 8 days of the anti-PCP treatment. So because in the initial 3 to 5 days, there occur early and reversible deterioration. This is due to the inflammatory response caused by the antibiotic-induced lysis of the organism in the lung. So if after 4 days there is no improvement, then we can label it as the clinical failure. And in this case, repeat bronchoalveolar lavage should be done to look for any co-infection, and HRCT thorax to monitor the course of the PCP, and also to check for any complications like spontaneous pneumothorax or pleural effusion. So here our options are primaquine with clindamycin and pentamidine IV. And all the non-HIV patients which are successfully treated with PCP should be given the secondary prophylaxis. So what are the drug-related adverse effects, the drug used for the PCP treatment? So cotrimoxazole is associated with nephrotoxicity, electrolyte imbalance, bone marrow suppression, and hepatotoxicity. Clindamycin most commonly for the Clostridium difficile diarrhea, and primaquine is associated with hemolysis in the G6PD deficient patient. Pentamidine, it can also cause nephrotoxicity, electrolyte imbalance. Along with that, it is associated with pancreatitis and QT prolongation. Next is the Toxoplasma gondii. This is ubiquitous intracellular protozoan parasite. It reactivates infection occur when there is reactivation of the latent tissue cyst. So it can cause Toxoplasma infection or the Toxoplasma disease. So what is Toxoplasma infection? So when there is seroconversion in a previously seronegative person, or the presence of detectable Toxoplasma in the PCR by PCR in the blood without the evidence of the organ involvement. Then the Toxoplasma disease. So here the Toxoplasma infection, along with that the organ involvement is present. This is known as the disease. So it can be like possible disease when the radiological and clinical findings are consistent with the organ involvement. Probable disease, along with that radiological and clinical clinical factors, there are the Toxoplasma is detectable. Toxoplasma DNA is detectable by PCR, either in the blood, tissue, or the body fluid. And the definitive disease is when the histological or cytological evidence of the organ damage is present. So they can, Toxoplasma can have a wide variety of clinical manifestations. So here the most common manifestations which have been described in the literature are the cerebral toxoplasmosis, pulmonary toxoplasmosis with ARDS, and the disseminated toxoplasmosis. So in case of cerebral toxoplasmosis, it can present either as a brain abscess or encephalitis. So brain abscess, there will be in the imaging or the MRI features will be homogeneous nodules, which are ring enhancement and associated with surrounding edema and the mass effect. And to diagnose it, CSF, PCR, generally PCR is used in the CSF, and sometimes in the undefined case, brain biopsy can be done. So the management of toxoplasma infection in a stem cell transplant patient. So prior to the engraftment, serological screening to be done both for the donor and the recipient for the risk stratification. Then the preventive therapy, either in the form of prophylaxis or the preemptive strategy to be used. And this preemptive therapy is recommended when the recipient is positive, but it is not recommended when the recipient is negative. And even after a prophylaxis or the preemptive therapy, when the patient shows the symptoms of toxoplasma, then it can be diagnosed as a probable or the definitive disease when it is along with the sign symptoms. The toxoplasma DNA is detectable by PCR either in the blood, ball, or the CSF sample. So when there is a probable or the definitive disease, then the treatment to be started as early as possible. So the treatment options, the drug of choice is the pyrimethamine sulfadiazine, and alternatively atovaquone doxycycline can also be used. Treatment duration is up to 4 to 6 weeks. And whenever possible, immunosuppressant drug should be discontinued. Then the monitoring of the blood monitoring by PCR to be done. And in case of cerebral edema, the steroid is used. Lastly, we'll discuss about the nocardiosis. So this is aerobic gram-positive non-motile branching filamentous bacilli. So it infection acquired through inhalation, and then it disseminates hematogenously to other areas. The post-transplant patients, they constitute around 1/3 of the nocardiosis. Risk factors for nocardiosis are use of corticosteroids, tacrolimus, and the high calcineurin inhibitors. But one thing we should remember that the low-dose cotrimoxazole, which is generally used for prophylactic therapy in a CMV infection, that is not effective to prevent the nocardiosis. To diagnose nocardiosis, at least one positive culture should be there from the respiratory or blood or the wound sample. It can show a spectrum of diseases. So like in the skin, erythematous and ulcerated nodular skin lesions can be found. Then it can affect the pulmonary system, like the excavated mass. It's seen here in the right upper lobe of the lung. And this is after the 6 weeks of the treatment. Then it can also affect the CNS system in the form of, like, it can cause cerebral abscess. Empirical treatment options for treating nocardiosis are cotrimoxazole, imipenem, amikacin, and linezolid. So duration of treatment, the IV antibiotics is generally given for 2 to 3 weeks for pulmonary and the cutaneous nocardiosis. And it is prolonged, that is 6 weeks IV antibiotics is needed for the CNS nocardiosis. The total duration of therapy is around 4 months. So to conclude, opportunistic infections are a major cause of morbidity and mortality in a hematological patient. So these patients should be monitored very closely, and when suspected, they should be investigated properly to identify the disease early and for the early identification and the treatment. Thank you.